January 1974, a father, a mother, and two young children were found murdered in their Wichita home, each one carefully bound. No witnesses, no arrests. The killer sent letters calling himself BTK, bind, torture, kill. For 3 decades he lived among his neighbors, went to church, raised a family. Then he sent a computer disk to police, and everything unraveled. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The address sat plain and unremarkable on a Tuesday morning, 803 North Edgemoor Street, Wichita, Kansas. Frost edged the windows. Inside, Joseph Otero moved through the kitchen, 38 years old, a man built by routine and responsibility. His wife Julie, 34, gathered school lunches. Their children shuffled between bedrooms and the bathroom, voices soft in the early hour. 2 teenage children grabbed backpacks, called goodbyes, and stepped into the coal. The front door closed behind them, muffling the sound of the street. Inside, the house settled into a quieter rhythm. Joseph Jr., 9, and Josephine, 11, lingered in their rooms, still half-dressed for the day. Their parents moved between the kitchen and hallway, pulling the morning forward one small task at a time. Outside, a neighbor scraped ice from a windshield. Another backed a car down the driveway. No one looked twice at the modest home where the Oteros lived. There was no reason to. It was just another house, just another family, just another winter morning in a city where people trusted their neighbors and locked their doors more out of habit than fear. Joseph checked his watch. Julie folded a dish towel. The younger children called from their rooms, asking about breakfast, about the time, about whether they needed jackets. The answers came easy, automatic, woven into the fabric of a life built on small certainties. The light shifted as the sun climbed higher, shadows moved across the walls. The house felt ordinary, familiar, safe. It was the kind of place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. But something terrible had already begun. Dennis Rader had been watching for weeks. He studied their patterns the way a student studies a textbook, methodical and patient. The Oteros became what he would later call a project, a term so cold it stripped them of humanity before he ever touched them. He parked away from the house that morning, walked the short distance on foot, his breath visible in the frozen air. He carried a gun, rope, and a mind shaped by years of dark fantasy. The bindings he imagined were not improvisations. They were rehearsed in his thoughts, refined through obsession. Rader was an Air Force veteran. Married, a father, he worked in compliance, a job that gave him a uniform sense of authority. Neighbors knew him as reliable, even strict. No one suspected that behind the ordinary exterior lived someone who turned human beings into objects, who reduced a family to targets on a list. He broke into the Otero home before they fully woke, found a place to hide, waited. The house stirred around him, footsteps overhead, water running, voices calling from room to room. He listened to it all, heart steady, mind focused on the moment he would step into their lives and take control. When the older children left for school, he knew the house had become smaller, more manageable. 4 people remained: Joseph, Julie, the boy, the girl. He had planned for this. He had imagined it in detail, over and over, until the fantasy demanded to become real. Rader moved quietly through the house, checking angles, listening to the rhythm of their morning. He was not in a hurry. He had time. He had a gun. He had a plan built on bondage imagery and control fantasies that stretched back years. The Oteros had no idea he was there. They were simply living, unaware that someone had already decided how their day would end. When Rader revealed himself, the gun did the talking. Voices rose, then fell under the weight of fear. He moved through the house with calm efficiency, binding each family member, his hands steady, his mind fixed on the sequence he had rehearsed. Joseph fought to understand what was happening, his instinct to protect his family clashing against the reality of a weapon pointed at them. Julie's fear was immediate, visceral, a mother's terror compounded by helplessness. The children looked to their parents for answers that would not come. Rader killed Joseph first, strangling him with deliberate patience. Then Julie. Then Joseph Jr., 9 years old, a boy who moments before had been thinking about school and friends and the small concerns of childhood. Each death was an act of control, each binding a statement of dominance. Josephine was last. He took her to the basement, hanged her, then violated her after death, an act driven by sexual gratification and the bondage obsession that shaped every choice he made. The cruelty was not incidental. It was the point. Outside, the city continued. Cars passed, a dog barked, someone checked the mail. The world moved forward, ignorant of what had happened inside a house that looked like every other house on the block. When Rader finally left, the Otero home was silent. 4 people who had woken to an ordinary morning would never see another. He walked back to his car, drove away, and returned to his own life as if nothing had changed. But inside 803 North Edgemoor, time had stopped. The house held its terrible secret, waiting for someone to open the door and discover what had been stolen. The older children returned that afternoon, school bags slung over their shoulders, minds on homework and dinner. They opened the front door and stepped into a silence that felt wrong. Then they saw their father, their mother, their younger brother, their sister, bound, lifeless, positioned in different rooms as if arranged by someone who wanted every discovery to land like a separate blow. The screams that followed were raw, primal, the sound of a world collapsing. Emergency calls were made. Voices shaking, words barely coherent. Operators tried to parse the horror being described, dispatching units with urgent codes that brought sirens racing through quiet streets. Police arrived first, then paramedics, then detectives. Yellow tape went up around the property. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, faces pale, whispering questions no one could answer. Inside, investigators moved carefully through the crime scene, documenting what they found with photographs and notes that would later fill boxes of evidence. 4 victims, all bound, no signs of forced entry from the outside, but clear evidence of control from within. The ligatures were deliberate, tied with care, emphasizing dominance. Joseph in one room, Julie in another, Joseph Jr. near his father, Josephine in the basement, her body staged in a way it spoke to something far darker than robbery or rage. The lead detective stood in the living room, trying to make sense of it. This was not a burglary that turned violent. This was not a domestic dispute. This was planned, patient, personal. He looked at the bindings again, the way each victim had been restrained. The killer had taken his time. He had been in the house long enough to do this methodically, without rushing, without panic. That realization settled over the investigation like a weight. They were not looking for someone who lost control. They were looking for someone who sought it. The days that followed moved in slow, grinding increments. At Wichita Police Headquarters, investigators spread crime scene photographs across tables, each image a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The lead detective reviewed the evidence again and again. The bindings, the lack of theft, the intimate cruelty of the murders. Early theories suggested a home invasion, but that explanation crumbled under scrutiny. Home invaders took valuables and fled. They did not spend hours binding and killing each family member with such deliberate care. Fingerprints were lifted from surfaces throughout the house, but none matched anyone in existing databases. Neighbors were interviewed, but no one had seen anything unusual. The street had been quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that made people feel safe. Forensic experts cataloged physical evidence, fibers, biological samples, the ligatures themselves. Semen was found at the scene, preserved carefully for future analysis. At the time, DNA testing was still years away from becoming a standard investigative tool, but the samples were stored with the understanding that science might one day catch up to the case. The evidence pointed to someone who had planned this attack, who had studied the family, who had entered their home with a clear intention to bind, control, and kill. The positioning of the bodies, especially Josephine's in the basement, suggested a sexual component, a fantasy being enacted rather than a crime of opportunity. Reporters called the police station daily, pressing for updates. Headlines ran in the Wichita Eagle, framing the murders as a shocking family tragedy that had shaken the city. Residents began checking their locks more carefully, glancing over their shoulders in grocery store parking lots. But without a suspect, without a clear motive beyond the physical evidence of control and sadism, the investigation stalled. Leads were followed, then abandoned. Witnesses were re-interviewed, but their statements added nothing new. The Otero file grew thicker, filled with photographs, reports, and unanswered questions. The lead detective closed it each night with a sense of frustration that grew heavier over time. Somewhere in Wichita, the person who had killed 4 members of the Otero family was still walking free. October 1974 brought a new chill to the city, but the cold that settled over Wichita that month had nothing to do with the weather. A letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle, typed anonymous. The editor opened it, read the first line, and immediately called the police. The writer claimed responsibility for the Otero murders. He provided details that had never been released to the public, specifics about the crime scene, about the bindings, about the order in which the family had been killed. There was no question the letter was authentic, but it was the closing that made investigators' blood run cold. The writer had given himself a name, BTK, bind, torture, kill. The lead detective read the letter in a conference room surrounded by other officers. The words on the page, both confirmation and taunt. The person they were hunting was not hiding in silence. He was stepping forward, demanding recognition, branding himself as if murder were a form of self-expression. The letter was logged as evidence, analyzed for fingerprints and trace materials. Handwriting, or in this case, typewriting, was studied. Forensic linguists examined the phrasing, looking for patterns that might point to education level, regional background, psychological profile. The Wichita Eagle ran a story about the letter, though key details were withheld to protect the integrity of the investigation. The headline was enough. The Otero killer had a name now, and he wanted the city to know it. Public reaction was immediate. Fear that had been simmering since January boiled over into something sharper, more pervasive. BTK was not just a killer. He was a communicator, someone who wanted attention, who saw his crimes as performances deserving of an audience. Investigators convened task force meetings, bringing in experts on serial offenders, psychologists who specialized in violent fantasies, and forensic specialists who could advise on how best to analyze the letter and any future communications. The consensus was grim. BTK would kill again. The letter made that clear. He was organized, patient, and driven by internal fantasies that would not be satisfied by a single family's destruction. The city braced itself, not knowing when or where he would strike next, only that he would. The years that followed blurred into a long, exhausting spiral of fear and investigation. Between 1974 and 1991, BTK killed at least 10 people, each murder echoing the same methodical cruelty displayed at 803 North Edgemoor. His victims varied, different ages, different genders, but the pattern remained consistent. He watched them, learned their routines, broke into their homes, bound them, killed them. Sometimes he sent letters afterward, poems that mixed bragging with coded references, taunting messages that kept investigators chasing leads that led nowhere. The city of Wichita lived under a shadow. Parents walked children to bus stops. Neighbors organized watch groups. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and window locks. Every unexpected noise at night became a potential threat. The lead detective and his team worked relentlessly, following up on tips that flooded in after each new letter or confirmed killing. They consulted with FBI profilers, compared BTK's communications to other serial offenders, and built psychological profiles that described a man obsessed with control, likely living an outwardly normal life, possibly holding a steady job. But knowing what kind of person they were looking for did not bring them closer to finding him. BTK was disciplined. He left little physical evidence. He chose victims who lived alone or in vulnerable situations, places where a break-in might not be noticed immediately. The letters continued. In some, he referenced other notorious killers, positioning himself within a pantheon of violence. In others, he mocked the police, suggesting they were too slow, too conventional, too bound by rules to ever catch someone as clever as him. Reporters covered every development, every letter, every confirmed victim. The Wichita resident, a composite of thousands, felt the weight of it in grocery store conversations, in school drop-off lines, in late-night discussions about whether it was safe to let teenagers walk home after dark. The fear was not abstract. It was lived, daily, pressing against the edges of ordinary life, and reminding everyone that evil could be patient, organized, and invisible. By the late 1980s, task force members began to wonder if BTK might eventually make a mistake, leave behind a fingerprint, or be caught for an unrelated crime that would reveal his identity. But the breakthroughs never came. And then, in 1991, the letters stopped. The confirmed murders stopped. BTK went silent. The silence was almost worse than the fear. At least fear had a shape, a name, a pattern to track. Silence was a void that investigators could not interrogate. The lead detective, now older and closer to retirement, reviewed the BTK files one more time, looking for something he might have missed. But the evidence had been combed through dozens of times. Every letter analyzed, every crime scene revisited, every witness re-interviewed. The consensus among law enforcement began to shift. Maybe BTK had died. Maybe he had moved out of state. Maybe he had been arrested for another crime and was sitting in a prison somewhere under a different name, his connection to BTK undetected. The Otero case, along with the other BTK murders, moved from active investigation to cold case status. Boxes of evidence were cataloged and stored. Files were archived. New detectives joined the department, heard the stories, but had no fresh leads to pursue. The Wichita resident felt the shift too. Conversations about BTK became less frequent, replaced by other concerns, other news cycles. The fear did not disappear entirely, but it faded into background unease, the kind of low-grade anxiety that becomes part of a city's identity. Some believed BTK was gone for good. Others suspected he was still out there, simply dormant, waiting for a reason to resurface. The uncertainty itself was a kind of haunting, a question mark that refused to be erased. Detectives who had worked the case moved on to other assignments, retired, or left the force altogether. The institutional memory remained, but the active pursuit slowed to a near stop. By the early 2000s, the BTK case looked like thousands of other cold cases across the country, tragic, infamous, and seemingly unsolvable. The evidence sat in storage, preserved but untouched, waiting for a technological breakthrough or a stroke of investigative luck that might never come. In Park City, a suburb of Wichita, Dennis Rader lived quietly. He worked, attended church, raised his children, served on community boards. His neighbors saw him as strict, maybe a little rigid, but otherwise unremarkable. He believed he had won. He believed he was smarter than everyone who had tried to catch him. And for more than a decade, it seemed he was right. The cold case detective inherited the BTK files in the early 2000s, part of a new generation of investigators trained in forensic techniques that had not existed when the Otero murders first occurred. She sat in a records room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and opened the boxes one by one. Photographs from 803 North Edgemoor. Autopsy reports. Letters typed on old machines. 1. Evidence logs listing fibers, ligatures, and biological samples preserved for future analysis. The biological samples caught her attention. Semen collected from the Otero crime scene, carefully stored. At the time it was gathered, DNA testing was still emerging as a forensic tool. Now, decades later, it was standard practice. She made notes, reviewed timelines, cross-referenced victim information with the letters BTK had sent. The pattern was clear: a killer who craved control, who turned his crimes into performances, who needed recognition as much as he needed to kill. But the trail was cold. No new communications. No new murders that fit the profile. The evidence was solid, but without a suspect to compare it to, it could not move the case forward. The cold case detective discussed the files with her colleagues, with forensic experts, with retired officers who had worked the original investigation. Everyone agreed, unless BTK made contact again, the case would remain unsolved. Across the city, the Wichita resident marked the passage of time with a kind of resigned awareness. BTK was part of local history now, a name spoken with both fear and frustration. Parents told their children the story as a cautionary tale. Journalists wrote retrospective pieces on slow news days. The reporter, covering crime for a local outlet, periodically revisited the case in articles that asked whether BTK would ever be caught, whether he was still alive, whether justice would ever come for the Otero family and the other victims. The answers remained elusive. The files sat on shelves. The city moved forward, carrying the weight of unresolved grief, like a scar that never fully healed. But beneath the surface, something was beginning to shift. The calendar was turning toward an anniversary that would pull Dennis Rader out of his silence and back into the light. In early 2004, newsrooms across Wichita began planning coverage for the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. 30 years. A full generation had passed since January 15, 1974. The reporter coordinated with editors, pulling archival footage and photographs, reaching out to retired detectives and criminologists for interviews. The story had all the elements of a true crime retrospective: a brutal, unsolved crime, a serial killer who vanished, a community still haunted by unanswered questions. Broadcasts aired in January 2004, timed to the anniversary. News anchors recounted the basic facts. The Otero family, 803 North Edgemoor Street, 4 victims bound and killed in their own home. The letters signed BTK. The years of terror, the sudden silence in 1991. Viewers watched with a mix of emotions. Older residents remembered the fear vividly. Younger viewers learned the story for the first time, shocked that such horror had unfolded in their city and that the person responsible had never been caught. The Wichita resident called in to talk radio shows, wrote letters to the editor, debated whether BTK was still alive. Some believed he had died or been imprisoned for another crime. Others thought he had simply moved away, taking his secrets with him. The coverage did more than refresh public memory. It reached into a quiet home in Park City, where Dennis Rader sat watching the television screen, seeing his crimes discussed, analyzed, remembered. He felt a familiar pull, recognition, attention. The acknowledgement that he had done something the city could not forget, even after 30 years. Rader's ego, dormant but never extinguished, stirred. He had spent more than a decade in silence, convinced he had outsmarted the police, but the anniversary coverage reminded him that his story was fading, being retold by others, interpreted by journalists and experts who did not know the truth the way he did. He began to think about stepping back into the spotlight. Not to confess, not to turn himself in, but to remind Wichita and the world that BTK was not a ghost. He was real. He was still here. And he was still in control. The anniversary broadcasts became the spark that would eventually burn down everything he had built. Dennis Rader lived in Park City, a suburb where neighbors waved to each other and lawns were mowed on schedule. He worked as a municipal compliance officer, enforcing city ordinances, checking properties for violations. It was a job that suited him, structured, authoritative, giving him a legitimate reason to observe people's homes. He was married, a father of 2, president of the church council, at Christ Lutheran Church, where he attended services and participated in community events. To everyone who knew him, he was reliable, maybe a bit rigid, but otherwise ordinary. Inside, he carried the memories of 10 murders, the Otero family, the others who followed, the bindings, the control, the letters he had sent, bragging and taunting, playing a game he believed he was winning. For more than a decade, he had kept silent. He told himself it was discipline, strategy, the mark of someone smart enough to know when to fade into the background. But the 30th anniversary coverage gnawed at him. He watched news segments that treated BTK as a historical mystery, a cold case that might never be solved. Experts speculated about his fate. Retired detectives admitted they had run out of leads. The message was clear. BTK had beaten them, but Rader wanted more than a cold file gathering dust. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted people to know that he was not dead, not imprisoned, not gone. He was here, living among them, untouchable. The urge to communicate grew stronger. He began drafting letters in his mind, imagining packages he could leave around town, puzzles that would prove he was still active, still in control. He believed he understood technology well enough to stay safe. He believed the police were still too slow, too conventional, too bound by procedure to catch someone as clever as him. That belief, rooted in decades of evading capture, would prove to be his fatal flaw. But in early 2004, sitting in his modest home, watching television coverage of crimes he had committed 30 years earlier, Dennis Rader did not see danger ahead. He saw opportunity. He saw a chance to reclaim the narrative, to remind everyone that BTK was not a memory. He was a presence, and he was about to speak again. The first package appeared in late 2004. A reporter found it near a public location, wrapped and marked in a way that immediately raised suspicion. Inside were items that referenced BTK, documents, photographs, objects that only the killer would possess. The Wichita police were contacted. The package was logged as evidence. Investigators compared the contents to known BTK communications from the 1970s and 1980s, looking for consistency in tone, handwriting, and signature details. The analysis confirmed what many feared. BTK was back. More communications followed. Letters mailed to the media. Packages left in conspicuous places. Puzzles designed to taunt investigators and prove that the sender was the original killer, not a copycat seeking attention. The cold case detective and her team moved quickly, establishing protocols for handling each new communication. Every piece of paper, every envelope, every object was analyzed for fingerprints, DNA, and any trace evidence that might finally identify the sender. Public reaction was immediate and intense. The Wichita resident who had begun to believe BTK was gone now faced the unsettling reality that he had been there all along, simply waiting. Fear returned, sharper than before, because it carried the weight of 30 years of unresolved trauma. The reporter covered each development, balancing the public's need for information with law enforcement's request to withhold certain details that might compromise the investigation. Headlines asked whether BTK would kill again, whether his return signaled a new wave of violence. Investigators did not know, but they recognized an opportunity. Every communication was a risk for the sender, a chance for him to make a mistake. They needed him to keep talking, keep sending packages, keep believing he was smarter than the people trying to catch him. In one letter, Rader asked a question that would change everything. He wanted to know if a computer floppy disk could be traced back to him. Could he send information digitally and remain anonymous? The police saw the opening. They crafted a public response, placing an ad in the newspaper assuring him that a floppy disk would be safe to send, that it could not be traced. It was a lie, and Rader believed it. The purple Memorex floppy disk arrived at a local television station in early 2005. Staff recognized it as significant and immediately contacted the police. The cold case detective received the disc with a mixture of hope and caution. If this was authentic, If it contained information only BTK would know, and if the digital forensics team could extract usable data, it might finally provide the breakthrough they needed. The forensic expert loaded the disk onto an isolated computer system, taking care to preserve every bit of data without contaminating the evidence. The disk contained a document, but it was the metadata, the hidden information embedded in the file, that held the key. The analysis revealed that the document had been created on a computer at Christ Lutheran Church. More importantly, the metadata included a username, Dennis. The room went quiet. 30 years worth of hours. Investigation, thousands of hours of work, countless dead ends. And now they had a name and a location. Investigators cross-referenced church records. One name stood out: Dennis Rader, Municipal Compliance Officer, Church Council President, resident of Park City. The cold case detective stared at the name on the screen. It was almost too simple, too direct, but digital forensics did not lie. The disk had been used on a church computer. The user was named Dennis. Dennis Rader was associated with that church. Background checks began immediately. Rader's employment history, address history, and timeline were compared against the known BTK activity. He had lived in Wichita during the murders. He had been in the area when the letters were sent. He fit the profile: organized, disciplined, employed in a position that gave him authority and access to neighborhoods. But they needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed biological proof, and they knew exactly where to find it. The semen sample from the Otero crime scene, preserved for more than 3 decades, was still in storage. If they could obtain a DNA sample linked to Dennis Rader and match it to that evidence, the case would be airtight. The plan took shape quickly. They would obtain a sample from Rader's daughter through legal means, compare it to the Otero evidence, and if the match held, they would move to arrest. The floppy disk, sent in a moment of overconfidence, had opened the door. DNA would slam it shut. Investigators worked quietly, moving through Dennis Rader's background with methodical precision. Every detail had to align. Every piece of evidence had to be documented so carefully that no defense attorney could challenge it later. Rader's employment records showed he had worked in the Wichita area continuously since the early 1970s. His address history placed him in proximity to several of the BTK crime scenes. His job as a compliance officer gave him legitimate reasons to visit neighborhoods, to observe homes, to interact with residents without raising suspicion. His role at Christ Lutheran Church was confirmed through public records and interviews with church staff who knew him as a dedicated, if somewhat rigid, member of the congregation. The computer used to create the floppy disk document was located in the church office, a space Rader had regular access to as council president. The circumstantial case was strong, but circumstantial was not enough. They needed DNA. The plan to obtain a sample from Rader's daughter was executed with precision. A medical sample was collected legally, without her direct knowledge of its purpose, protecting her from involvement in an investigation that would soon turn her world upside down. The sample was sent to the lab with explicit instructions: compare it to the semen recovered from the Otero crime scene in 1974. The forensic expert understood the stakes. If the DNA matched, it would confirm that Dennis Rader was not just a suspect, but the killer who had terrorized Wichita for decades. The results came back within days. The DNA profile from Rader's daughter was consistent, in the expected familial way, with the profile derived from the Otero crime scene evidence. The biological link was undeniable. Dennis Rader was BTK. The cold case detective stood in the lab, looking at the report, feeling the weight of 30 years lifting and settling simultaneously. They had him. But the work was not finished. Arrest plans were drawn up. Warrants were prepared. Every officer involved was briefed on the need for caution, precision, and absolute adherence to legal protocol. Nothing could go wrong now. On the streets of Park City, Dennis Rader continued his routine, unaware that his life was about to collapse. He believed the police had assured him the floppy disk was safe. He believed he was still in control. He was wrong. The arrest plan was simple: a traffic stop on a public road during daylight hours, minimizing risk to bystanders and giving officers full control of the situation. On February 25, 2005, unmarked units positioned themselves along Rader's expected route. Patrol cars waited nearby, ready to move in once the stop was initiated. Radios crackled with brief, coded updates. The cold case detective sat in one of the vehicles, watching the road, knowing that the man they were about to arrest had evaded capture for more than 30 years. She thought of the Otero family, of the other victims, of the decades of fear and frustration. Then Rader's vehicle appeared. The signal was given. A patrol car pulled in behind him, lights flashing. Rader slowed and stopped on the shoulder, likely expecting a minor traffic issue. Officers approached, calm and professional. They asked him to step out of the vehicle. He complied, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he realized this was not a routine stop. They identified themselves, told him he was under arrest, read him his rights, cuffed his hands behind his back. He did not resist. He did not speak. Dennis Rader, municipal compliance officer, church council president, married father of 2, was placed in the back of a patrol car and driven to police headquarters. His vehicle was secured for processing. Across Wichita, news began to spread. A suspect in the BTK case had been arrested. His name was Dennis Rader. Residents pulled up search engines trying to place the name, trying to understand how someone who seemed so ordinary could be connected to such horror. The reporter received confirmation from law enforcement sources and immediately began drafting the story. This was not speculation. This was not a lead. This was an arrest, backed by evidence, ending a case that had haunted the city for decades. The Wichita resident felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. BTK was real. BTK had been caught, and BTK had been living among them the entire time. Inside the interrogation room, investigators prepared to confront Dennis Rader with the evidence that had finally brought him down. The interrogation room was small, sterile, equipped with recording devices that captured every word. Dennis Rader sat across from investigators, his hands cuffed, his expression carefully controlled. The cold case detective laid out the evidence piece by piece. The floppy disk sent to the television station, the metadata linking it to Christ Lutheran Church, the username Dennis. The church records confirming his access to that computer. Rader listened, his face betraying nothing. Then, the forensic expert entered carrying the lab report. The DNA evidence was explained in clear, unambiguous terms. A medical sample linked to his daughter had been compared to semen recovered from the Otero crime scene in 1974. The match was conclusive. The biological connection was undeniable. Rader's carefully maintained composure cracked. He understood what the evidence meant. There was no way to argue against DNA. No way to claim mistaken identity or coincidence. He confessed, not in a rush of emotion, but in a calm, methodical recitation of facts. He admitted to all 10 murders attributed to BTK. He confirmed details that only the killer would know. He described the Otero murders, the other killings, the letters, the packages, the years of silence. Investigators recorded every word, asking clarifying questions, ensuring the confession was complete and legally sound. The prosecutor, observing from another room, took notes, already building the case that would be presented in court. Outside the station, reporters gathered, cameras trained on the entrance. Word had leaked that Rader was confessing. The story was breaking in real time, spreading through news outlets, social media, and whispered conversations across Wichita. The Wichita resident watched the coverage with a sense of surreal validation. For 30 years, BTK had been a shadow, a name without a face, a threat that could not be stopped. Now he was a middle-aged man in handcuffs, confessing to crimes that had defined a generation's fear. The cold case detective stepped out of the interrogation room, exhausted but relieved. The confession was on record. The evidence was solid. The case, after 3 decades, was finally moving toward justice. But the hardest part was still ahead. hearing the details of what Rader had done and ensuring that every victim's story was told in court. In later court proceedings, Dennis R. Rader described the Otero murders with the detachment of someone giving a technical presentation. He explained how he had selected the family, calling them a project, a term that stripped away their humanity and reduced them to objects in his fantasy. He recounted parking away from 803 North Edgemoor, walking to the property, breaking in, and hiding until the family was awake and vulnerable. He described using a gun to control them, binding each person carefully, his hands steady as he tied the knots he had imagined for years. Joseph Otero was killed first, strangled while his family watched. Then Julie. Then 9-year-old Joseph Jr., a boy who had no capacity to understand why this was happening. Finally, Josephine. Rader admitted taking her to the basement, hanging her, and sexually assaulting her after death. The courtroom listened in silence. The prosecutor asked follow-up questions, ensuring every detail was entered into the official record. The defense attorney sat quietly, knowing there was no defense to mount against a confession this complete. The biological evidence, the semen recovered from the scene, was confirmed as Rader's through the DNA match. His own words aligned with the physical evidence investigators had preserved for more than 30 years. The judge listened carefully, aware that this testimony would form the basis for sentencing. Rader showed no emotion as he spoke, no remorse, only a clinical recounting of actions driven by control fantasies and sexual gratification rooted in bondage imagery. For the older Otero children, listening to this was unbearable. They heard a stranger describe the last moments of their parents and younger siblings in language so cold it felt like a second violation. The Wichita resident followed the coverage, reading transcripts, watching news clips. The details were horrifying, but there was also a grim sense of closure. The truth, no matter how painful, was finally being told. The criminologist, analyzing the case for training purposes, noted how Rader's own ego, his need to communicate, to be recognized, had led directly to his capture. The floppy disk was a turning point, but the detailed confession ensured there would be no legal ambiguity. Rader's words, recorded and preserved, became the final piece of evidence in a case built over decades. The Otero murders and all the others were no longer unsolved. They were documented, confessed, and ready for judgment. The formal legal proceedings moved quickly once Rader's confession was entered into the record. The prosecutor filed charges, 10 counts of first-degree murder, each representing a life stolen, a family destroyed, a community scarred. Rader's defense attorney reviewed the evidence and advised him of his options. There was no viable defense. The confession was clear. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The floppy disk metadata tied him directly to the communications. A trial would only prolong the inevitable and force victims' families to endure testimony they had already heard in pre-trial proceedings. Rader agreed to plead guilty to all the 10 counts. The decision was strategic, avoiding a prolonged trial, but it also fit his personality. He wanted credit for the crimes, acknowledgement of what he had done, even if it meant spending the rest of his life in prison. The plea hearing was held in a courtroom packed with reporters, law enforcement officers, and members of the public who had lived through the BTK years. The judge asked Rader if he understood the charges, if he understood he was waiving his right to a trial, and if he was entering his pleas freely and voluntarily. Rader answered each question in a steady voice, guilty, 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 10 times. The courtroom absorbed the words, each one a confirmation of horrors that had haunted Wichita for decades. The older Otero children were present, their faces reflecting the impossible task of watching the man who killed their family take responsibility in the most formal, emotionless way possible. The prosecutor outlined the evidence briefly for the record, referencing the floppy disk, the DNA match, and Rader's detailed confessions. The legal case was airtight. The guilty pleas were accepted. The next step was sentencing. Under Kansas law at the time the murders were committed, The death penalty was not available. The maximum punishment was life in prison. The prosecutor would argue for consecutive sentences, ensuring Rader would never be released. The Wichita resident followed the proceedings with mixed emotions. Relief that justice was being served. Frustration that the law's limitations meant Rader would not face execution. And a deep, lingering sadness for all the lives destroyed and all the years lost to fear. The case was moving toward its legal conclusion, but the emotional reckoning was far from over. Sentencing day arrived with a gravity that filled the courtroom before anyone spoke. The judge took the bench, the court was called to order, and the final chapter of the legal proceedings began. The prosecutor stood and addressed the court, summarizing the scale of Rader's crimes. 10 murders, decades of terror, families destroyed, a community held hostage by fear. The evidence, biological, digital, and confessional, left no doubt about his guilt. The prosecutor requested that the 10 life sentences run consecutively, not concurrently. This meant Rader would serve each sentence back to back, effectively ensuring he would die in prison, regardless of parole laws or future legal changes. The defense attorney offered no mitigation. There was nothing to say that could soften the impact of what Rader had done. The attorney's role was procedural, ensuring the legal process was followed correctly, preserving Rader's rights, even as those rights led, inevitably, to the harshest available punishment. The judge then spoke, addressing Rader directly. The tone was firm, measured, carrying the weight of the court's authority and the community's pain. The judge reviewed each count of murder, each victim's name, each life stolen: Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Joseph Otero Jr., Josephine Otero, the other 6 victims whose deaths were part of the same pattern of control and cruelty. The sentence was pronounced: 10 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each victim, no possibility of parole. Rader would spend the rest of his life in prison. The courtroom remained silent as the words settled. The older Otero children sat, motionless, processing the finality of it. The Wichita resident, watching on television or reading updates online, felt a measure of closure, however incomplete. The reporter noted the historical significance. This was the resolution of one of Kansas's most infamous cold cases, solved through a combination of technological advancement, investigative persistence, and the killer's own fatal overconfidence. Dennis Rader was led from the courtroom in shackles, disappearing through a door that separated him from the public forever. The man who had once believed he was smarter than everyone, who had killed 10 people and taunted law enforcement for years, was now just another inmate serving a life sentence with no chance of release. Justice, within the limits of the law, had been served. In the weeks and months following Rader's sentencing, Wichita began the slow process of healing. The BTK case, which had cast a shadow over the city for more than 30 years, was finally closed. But closure in a legal sense did not erase the trauma that had been lived and carried by so many. The Wichita resident talked about it in coffee shops, at community meetings, in quiet conversations on front porches. There was relief, yes, but also a lingering unease. Rader had been a neighbor, a compliance officer, a church leader. He had walked among them, enforcing rules, attending services, raising children. The realization that such a person could hide such darkness challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and safety. Law enforcement agencies held debriefings, analyzing what had worked and what could be improved. The floppy disk had been the breakthrough, a reminder that offenders who sought attention and control could be manipulated into making mistakes. The preservation of biological evidence from the Otero scene, even when DNA testing was not yet standard, had proven essential decades later. The cold case detective and her team received recognition for their work, but they deflected praise, knowing the case had been built on the efforts of generations of investigators who refused to let the files gather dust. The reporter wrote retrospective pieces, interviewing survivors, retired detectives, and experts who could contextualize the case within the broader history of serial crime investigations. The coverage emphasized that the Otero murders were not just the beginning of BTK's spree, but a distinct tragedy. 4 members of one family killed in their own home, their surviving children left to navigate a lifetime of grief. Public memorials were held. Flowers were placed near 803 North Edgemoor. Names were spoken aloud: Joseph, Julie, Joseph Jr., Josephine, ensuring they were remembered as people, not just victims, in a notorious case. The city also grappled with anger and frustration. Rader's life sentence was justice, but many felt it was insufficient given the scope of his crimes. The absence of the death penalty, due to the timing of the murders, remained a point of contention in public discourse. Still, there was a sense that something had shifted. The fear that had lived in Wichita for so long was finally replaced by knowledge. The unknown had been named, confronted, and locked away. The city could move forward, carrying its history, but no longer held hostage by it. The BTK case became a subject of study in academic and law enforcement circles, analyzed for what it revealed about serial offenders, investigative strategies, and the intersection of technology and criminal justice. The criminologist, teaching courses on criminal psychology, used the case as a primary example of how offenders driven by control, fantasies, and the need for recognition can be both highly dangerous and ultimately vulnerable to their own ego. Rader's decision to send the floppy disk, trusting the police's public assurance, was dissected as a case study in overconfidence. Forensic science programs highlighted the preservation of the Otero crime scene evidence as a model for how departments should handle biological materials, even when current technology cannot fully analyze them. The semen sample, stored carefully for more than 30 years, became usable only when DNA testing advanced and investigative circumstances allowed for a familial comparison. Law enforcement training sessions examined the letters and communications Rader sent over the years, teaching officers how to manage interactions with offenders who seek media attention. The strategy of publicly answering Rader's question about the floppy disk, knowing it was a lie designed to draw him into a trap, was presented as an example of tactical communication in serial investigations. The prosecutor spoke at conferences, emphasizing the importance of multi-generational investigative work. No single detective solved the BTK case. It was the accumulation of decades of effort, the careful documentation of every piece of evidence, and the willingness to revisit old files with new tools that eventually brought Rader to justice. The case also influenced policy discussions about how to balance public safety with the ethical implications of obtaining DNA through familial testing. Rader's daughter, who had no involvement in or knowledge of her father's crimes, became an unwitting but crucial link in the investigative chain. Her privacy and emotional well-being were considered in the broader debate about when and how such methods should be used. For the Wichita resident, the case's transformation into an educational tool was bittersweet. It was good that future investigators could learn from what happened, but it also meant the city's pain was being studied, dissected, and presented in classrooms far from Kansas. Still, there was value in ensuring that the lessons drawn from the Otero murders and the BTK case could help prevent or solve other crimes. The suffering had happened. The question now was whether something constructive could come from it. Years passed. Dennis Rader remained in prison, his name occasionally resurfacing in true crime documentaries, podcasts, and academic retrospectives. Each retelling brought the Otero murders back into public consciousness, reminding new audiences of what had happened on January 15, 1974. The older Otero children, now adults with families of their own, navigated the complex reality of being both survivors and public figures in a case that refused to fade from memory. They gave interviews when they felt it was important to honor their parents and siblings, and they declined when the attention became too much. For them, the case was not an academic exercise or a media story. It was their childhood, stolen It was the morning they left for school and came home to find their family gone. It was decades of grief, therapy, and the slow, painful work of building lives around an absence that could never be filled. The Wichita community continued to evolve, new residents moving in with no direct memory of the BTK years, while longtime residents carried the story as part of their identity. 803 North Edgemoor remained a known address, a place marked by history, even as life moved on around it. Memorials and remembrance events were held periodically, often on anniversaries of the murders or Rader's arrest. The focus was always on the victims, on ensuring their names and their humanity were not overshadowed by the notoriety of the person who killed them. The reporter, now older and reflecting on a career that had included covering one of the region's most significant criminal cases, often thought about the balance between informing the public and respecting the privacy and pain of those most affected. The case had shaped how she approached crime journalism, making her more attuned to the human cost behind every headline. The cold case detective, too, carried the case with her, even as she worked on other investigations. Solving the Otero murders and the BTK case had been a career-defining moment, but it also served as a reminder that justice, even when achieved, does not undo harm. It only provides a framework for accountability and perhaps a foundation for healing. Rader himself faded into the background of the prison system, his requests for attention largely ignored. The man who had once demanded recognition, who had branded himself and taunted an entire city, now lived in obscurity, stripped of the control he had craved. The story did not end with his sentencing. It continued in the lives of those left behind, in the lessons taught to new investigators, in the quiet moments when someone in Wichita paused and remembered a family that deserved better than to be remembered only for how they died. The Otero family story, at its core, is about ordinary people living ordinary lives until violence shattered everything. Joseph and Julie were parents trying to raise their children in a safe, stable home. Joseph Jr. and Josephine were kids thinking about school, friends, and the small dramas of childhood. They were not defined by what happened to them. They had lives before January 15, 1974. Birthdays, holidays, laughter, arguments, plans for the future. Those lives mattered. Those moments mattered. The investigation, the letters, the decades of fear, and the eventual capture of Dennis Rader all became part of their story. But they were not the whole story. The whole story includes the family dinners, the bedtime routines, the love that held them together before someone decided. They were a project. Remembering the Oteros means acknowledging that they were more than victims in a notorious case. They were people who deserved to live full, long lives. They deserved to see their children grow up, to celebrate milestones, to grow old together. The older Otero children have worked to keep that memory alive, to ensure that when people hear the names Joseph, Julie, Joseph Jr., and Josephine, they think of them as a family first, not just as the first victims of a serial killer. The case is studied because of what it reveals about criminal behavior, forensic science, and investigative persistence. But it should also be studied for what it reveals about the cost of violence, not just in the immediate horror of the crime scene, but in the decades of grief that follow, the lives rearranged, the trust broken, the safety lost. Wichita has moved forward, but it has not forgotten. The city carries the story, teaching younger generations about vigilance, about the importance of supporting victims' families, about the long, difficult work of seeking justice even when the odds seem impossible. The Otero murders and the BTK case are part of Kansas history, part of American criminal history, and part of the ongoing conversation about how communities respond to violence and how justice systems adapt to new challenges. But beneath all of that, beneath the case files and the courtroom transcripts and the academic studies, there are 4 people who woke up on a winter morning in 1974 and never got to see another day. Joseph, Julie, Joseph Jr., Josephine. They are the heart of the story. They are why the case mattered then and why it still matters now. As the sun sets over Wichita, the city continues its rhythm. Families gather for dinner. Children play in yards. Neighbors wave to each other. Life, as it always does, moves forward. But in quiet moments, in conversations between parents and children, in classrooms where local history is taught, the story of the Otero family and the BTK case is remembered. It is remembered not to glorify violence, but to honor victims, to acknowledge the resilience of survivors, and to understand that justice, even when delayed, still carries meaning. The cold case detective, now retired, sometimes drives past 803 North Edgemoor. The house looks ordinary. People live there now, building their own memories, their own routines. Life has reclaimed the space as it should. The prosecutor, reflecting on a career filled with difficult cases, considers the Otero case one of the most significant. Not because of the media attention or the notoriety, but because it demonstrated that persistence, science, and the refusal to give up can eventually bring answers. The forensic expert, still working in the lab, trains new technicians on the importance of evidence preservation, using the Otero biological samples as an example of how today's limitations might become tomorrow's breakthroughs. The reporter, the criminologist, the Wichita resident, all carry pieces of the story, shaped by their roles and their experiences. Together they form a collective memory that keeps the case alive, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of what was lost and what was, eventually, found. Dennis Rader remains in prison, his name occasionally mentioned in documentaries and true crime discussions, but his power to terrify is gone. He is simply an inmate serving a life sentence, stripped of the control he once wielded and the recognition he once craved. The older Otero children continue their lives, carrying the weight of their history, but not defined solely by it. They have built families, pursued careers, and found ways to live with a loss that never fully heals, but can, over time, become something they carry rather than something that carries them. Justice was served within the limits of the law. Rader will never be free. The evidence was preserved. The case was solved, and the truth was told. But peace is not something that arrives with a verdict. Peace is something the living must build day by day, memory by memory, choosing to honor the past without being consumed by it. In Wichita, porch lights glow against the twilight. Somewhere, a family sits down to dinner. Somewhere, a child asks a question, and a parent answers with honesty and care. Life continues, memory endures. And the Otero family, Joseph, Julie, Joseph Jr., and Josephine, are remembered not just for how they died, but for the fact that they lived. They mattered, and they will not be forgotten. Will not be forgotten. Will not be forgotten.